Vivien Hayes was a woman constructed entirely of right angles and careful decisions. As the head of the English department at St. Jude's Preparatory Academy, her life was a meticulously curated syllabus. She wore structured, tailored blazers in muted tones, navy, charcoal, forest green. She kept her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, elegant twist. She taught advanced placement literature to teenagers whose futures were already bought and paid for by their parents' trust funds. And she had a husband, David. David was a highly respected, exceptionally skilled, and entirely absent cardiologist. Their marriage was less a romantic partnership and more a mutually beneficial merger between two overachieving professionals. Their house in the suburbs was pristine, silent, and cold. When David was actually home, their conversations consisted of schedule coordinations and polite inquiries about each other's days that neither truly listened to. Vivien had spent the last 7 years convincing herself that this quiet, sterile existence was what peace felt like. There was no chaos. There was no heartbreak. There was no room for deviations. Then, Clara arrived. The faculty lounge at St. Jude's was a place of muted complaints and stale coffee. It was September, the air outside still clinging to the sticky heat of late summer, when Clara walked into the first staff meeting of the year. She was late. The heavy oak door creaked, drawing the eyes of 35 aggressively punctual educators. Clara slipped in, offering a breathless, unashamed apology to the headmaster. She was the new art director, and she looked like a splash of vibrant, chaotic paint on a gray canvas. Her dark, curly hair was piled into a messy bun, secured by what looked like a stray paintbrush. She wore a flowing bohemian skirt and a loose blouse, and her fingers were already faintly stained with cadmium red. On her left hand, a heavy, ornate gold wedding band caught the fluorescent light. It looked entirely too heavy for her delicate fingers, like an anchor she was forced to drag around. Vivien, sitting in the front row with her spine perfectly straight, felt a strange, uncomfortable hitch in her chest. As Clara scanned the room for an empty seat, their eyes met. It wasn't just a casual glance. In that singular, suspended second, Vivien felt a terrifying jolt of recognition that stripped away her carefully cultivated armor. It wasn't merely physical attraction, though Clara was undeniably, devastatingly beautiful. It was the shared, silent exhaustion of two women playing roles they had outgrown. Behind Clara's bright, apologetic smile, Vivien saw the same hollow fatigue she saw in her own bathroom mirror every morning. Months bled into the autumn term, and the leaves on the sprawling St. Jude's campus turned to bruised purples and burnt oranges. Vivien and Clara existed in a state of agonizing, magnetic orbit. Their interactions were initially brief, restricted to the edges of the school day. A shared pot of terrible coffee in the lounge. A brushed shoulder in the crowded, locker-lined hallway. A lingering gaze over the heads of uniformed teenagers during morning assembly. Every interaction, no matter how mundane, felt electric. Vivien learned about Clara's husband, Mark, in bits and pieces. He was a venture capitalist who spent more time in first-class cabins and sleek hotel bars than he did in their marital bed. "He sends me flowers from different area codes," Clara mentioned casually one afternoon in the copy room. The rhythmic thump-thud of the Xerox machine provided a steady backbeat to her confession. She didn't look at Vivien, focusing instead on the bright green light of the scanner. "Last week it was Tokyo. The week before, London. I have a house full of dying orchids and absolutely no one to talk to." Vivien had frozen, her hand hovering over a stack of permission slips. She looked at Clara's profile, the soft curve of her jaw, the stray curl falling across her cheek. The urge to reach out and tuck that curl behind Clara's ear was so sudden and violent it made Vivien dizzy. "I know exactly what you mean," Vivien had replied softly. "David is physically in the same time zone, but he hasn't truly looked at me in 5 years. I think I'm just a fixture in his house, like the dining room table." Clara finally turned to look at her, her dark eyes wide and vulnerable. The air in the tiny copy room felt suffocatingly thick. "It's terrifying," Clara whispered, stepping just a fraction of an inch closer, "realizing you've built a life you have no desire to live." The bell rang, shattering the moment like glass. They both jumped, retreating behind their professional masks. But the shift had happened. The invisible tether between them had pulled taut. As November approached, the school announced its annual winter production, The Crucible. Vivien was tasked with dramaturgical consulting, ensuring the students understood the weight of the text, while Clara was responsible for the set design. It was the perfect, terrible excuse to spend hours together. They spent their late afternoons and early evenings in the cavernous, drafty school auditorium. While the students rehearsed lines on stage, Vivien and Clara sat side by side in the dimly lit front row, their knees inches apart. Vivien found herself completely derailed. She would lose track of the dialogue on stage, entirely focused on the scent of turpentine and lavender soap that always clung to Clara. She watched the way Clara's hands moved when she sketched set pieces, confident, fluid, and passionate. It was everything Vivien's life was not. One Tuesday evening, after the students had gone home, they stayed behind to paint the backdrop. The auditorium was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft swish of brushes against canvas and the hum of the heating vents. Clara was standing on a low stepladder, reaching up to paint the stark, twisting branches of a Salem forest. She stretched, and her shirt rode up slightly, exposing an inch of warm olive skin at her waist. Vivien, holding a bucket of gray paint at the base of the ladder, stared. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt completely untethered, drifting in a dangerous, uncharted sea. "Hand me the smaller brush, would you?" Clara asked, glancing down. When Vivien reached up to hand it to her, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting contact, but Clara's hand spasmed slightly, and the brush tumbled to the floor. Neither of them moved to pick it up. Clara looked down at Vivien, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The ambient light caught the unshed tears in her eyes. "Vivien," she breathed, a plea wrapped in a single word. "I know," Vivien replied, her voice trembling. "I know." But they didn't act. Not yet. The weight of their heavy gold rings, the specters of David and Mark, and the absolute scandal of two married female teachers at a conservative private school kept them locked in their agonizing stalemate. The climax of their silent dance arrived on a Thursday evening in late November. A freak, torrential downpour had essentially locked down the campus. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the rain lashed against the Gothic stone of the buildings with furious intent. The final bell had rung hours ago, the students had been swept away in a parade of luxury SUVs, and St. Jude's was tomb-silent. Vivien sat at her desk in classroom 4B, staring blindly at a stack of essays analyzing the awakening. The irony was not lost on her. She couldn't focus on the red ink in her hand. The drumming of the rain against the tall windows felt like a heartbeat, fast, erratic, and demanding. David had called an hour ago. He was stuck at a medical conference in Chicago due to the weather. He wouldn't be back until Sunday. It was a clinical, informational phone call that ended without an "I love you." Vivien stood up, dropping her red pen. The quiet of her classroom was suddenly unbearable. Her feet moved on their own volition, carrying her out the door and down the dimly lit corridor. She walked past the science labs, past the administrative offices, moving inexorably toward the north wing. Toward the art studio. The door to the studio was ajar, spilling a slice of warm, golden light into the dark, shadowy hallway. Vivien paused, her hand resting flat against the cool wood of the doorframe. She closed her eyes, taking one last shaky breath as the respectable, rigid woman she was supposed to be. Then, she pushed the door open. The studio was a sanctuary of controlled chaos. Canvases leaned against walls, and the air was thick with the smell of oil paint and damp earth from the open window. Clara was standing before a massive canvas in the center of the room. She was barefoot, dressed in a loose, paint-splattered linen shirt and worn-out jeans. On a pedestal nearby sat a simple still life arrangement, a single vivid red apple resting beside a shattered ceramic bowl. "It's an allegory," Clara said softly over the sound of the rain. She didn't turn around. She had known Vivien was there. She always knew. "The pristine surface," Vivien murmured, stepping fully into the room, "and the inevitable break." "Exactly." Clara finally turned. The bright, chaotic bravado she usually wore like armor was completely stripped away. She looked exhausted, vulnerable, and more beautiful than Vivien had ever seen her. She set her palette down on a stool and walked slowly toward Vivien. The distance between them shrank until the air felt too thick to breathe. "David is in Chicago," Vivien found herself saying. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain the facade of their normal lives, to remind them both of the boundaries they were standing on the edge of. "He won't be back until Sunday." Mark is in Dubai, Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were locked onto Vivien's lips. He asked his assistant to email me a happy anniversary message this morning. The tragedy of their parallel lives hung heavily in the quiet space between them. Two women, encased in the gilded, suffocating cages of their respectable, hollow marriages. Clara reached out. Her hand trembled slightly as her paint-stained fingers gently grazed the rigid lapel of Vivien's pristine navy blazer. The touch sent a shockwave straight through Vivien's chest, shattering years of carefully constructed, agonizing restraint. The cold, sterile walls she had built around her heart cracked open, letting in a flood of terrifying warmth. "I am so tired of pretending, Vivien," Clara murmured, her thumb brushing against Vivien's collarbone. "I'm tired of being a wife in a photograph. I'm tired of coming to this school every day and pretending I don't spend the entire day just waiting to see you." Vivien's breath hitched. "Clara!" "Tell me to stop," Clara said fiercely, taking a half-step closer. They were so close now that Vivien could feel the heat radiating from Clara's body. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong. Tell me you don't feel like you're starving every time we're in the same room. Tell me, and I will pack up my things, go back to my empty house, and never look at you like this again." Vivien couldn't speak. The syllabus was gone. The rules of her meticulously planned life had evaporated into the humid air of the art studio. The heavy gold ring on her left hand suddenly felt like a physical shackle cutting into her skin, one she was finally, desperately ready to unfasten. Instead of telling her to stop, Vivien let out a fractured sob. She reached up and cupped Clara's face in both of her hands. Clara's skin was incredibly warm, her cheekbone resting perfectly in the palm of Vivien's hand, as if it had been designed to fit there. Clara let out a shaky, quiet gasp, leaning into the touch as if she had been wandering in a freezing desert her entire life and had finally found a fire. When their lips met, it wasn't tentative. It wasn't a gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was the desperate, breathless collision of two people who had been drowning for years and had suddenly, miraculously broken the surface for air. Vivien's hands tangled fiercely in the messy bun at the nape of Clara's neck, pulling her flush against her body. Clara's arms wrapped tightly around Vivien's waist, her fingers gripping the expensive fabric of the blazer like a lifeline. The kiss tasted of unshed tears, the faint bitterness of coffee, and the sharp, undeniable truth of what they had been hiding from themselves. It was messy, deep, and utterly devastating to the lives they had built. Decades of compulsory perfection and performative heterosexuality melted away in the consuming warmth of Clara's mouth. Vivien backed Clara up until her hips hit the edge of a sturdy drafting table. Clara hoisted herself up onto the edge, pulling Vivien perfectly between her legs, never breaking the kiss. Vivien kissed her with a hunger that terrified her, her hands roaming over the soft linen of Clara's shirt, memorizing the curve of her waist, the dip of her spine. Every suppressed desire, every lingering look across the faculty lounge, every moment of silent agony they had shared poured into the physical connection. Clara tasted like freedom. She felt like home. When they finally broke apart, it was only because their lungs were burning for oxygen. Their foreheads rested against each other, both of them panting, chests heaving in the quiet room. Outside, the rain continued its fierce, relentless drumbeat against the tall windows, isolating them from the rest of the world. But inside, the storm that had been brewing for months had finally broken. "What do we do now?" Clara whispered. A single tear escaped, tracking through a faint smudge of charcoal on her cheek. Vivien reached up, gently wiping the tear away with a pad of her thumb. She looked past Clara's shoulder at the red apple on the pedestal, sitting beside the shattered bowl. The pristine surface was gone. There was no going back to the way things were. The terrifying, beautiful unknown stretched out before them. But as Vivien looked back into the dark, profound eyes of the woman who had just woken her up from a 7-year sleep, she realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the unwritten page. "Now," Vivien said softly, her voice steadier and stronger than it had been in a decade, "we stop avoiding the truth. We stop pretending." Clara let out a wet, breathless laugh, pulling Vivien back down by the lapels of her jacket for another kiss, slower and infinitely more tender this time. The cage doors were open, and the sky outside was waiting.